The next group of Indian tribes we're going to talk about is in the southwest of the United States and the western part of the United States. So there's a couple things you're going to do. I copied the book pages that we're going to be reading today. So you'll click on that and you can pull it up and you can follow along. Or if you need to go back and reference it, it is there for you. I also included the note sheet that you're going to be taking notes on as we read the book pages. And then finally, your homework is this worksheet 18 that you'll be filling out. So if we go ahead and click on the note sheet, so you can pull it up and you can walk through it. And then we're going to click, remember, edit presentation, edit in browser. And then I usually need to zoom in. So again, if you need to zoom in, you're going to click view. And then I usually choose about 100% for the zoom. So when it pulls up, I'm going to click view. So I just click that arrow and then click view, zoom, 100%. So as we go through, you can see we're going to talk about the Southwest, what the land was like, how they adapted to the Southwest, so staple foods, but they also grew something and used that to weave something. Then we're going to talk about the Pueblo culture, what shaped their lives, and then what they depended on for resources not found nearby. So how did they get those resources? And then we're going to talk about the religion and government of the Pueblo culture, who led the Navajo ceremonies, and then what had a strong role in the government of the Pueblo. Then we'll talk about the groups to the west. And there's three groups of people that lived there. We're going to talk about their way of life. And then trading for needed goods. People formed something to be able to trade those goods. And why did they form that? So we're going to be filling that out as we go. Our lesson title today is Southwest and West. Just filling that out. And then as we go along, filling this in too. So we're going to start here with the reading. So we're going to start the you are there. Today you worked in the hot sun, digging a path that will bring water to your tribe's crops. Water is so precious in this dry land. You are glad that it will not be wasted. As you stand at the top of your pueblo, which is these houses here, you can see the fine crops below. They lie at the base of the flat-topped mesas and deep cliffs where your people have lived for hundreds of years. Even though you're tired from the day's work, you're excited. Tonight, a storyteller will tell a tale of your ancestors, the ancient Puebloans. So it kind of gives you an idea and a look and a feel of what life was like. And you can see here in this picture, the homes they lived in, their way of life. There's got the clay ovens that they used to cook. They've got looms where they're weaving cloth for clothes and blankets. Here they're grinding corn to make meals. They can make different foods. This is how they got in and out of the houses. You can see there's ladders there. They made clay pottery that they used to store food and water. And then this is where they had different ceremonies, a kiva. And they're all just living together. And if you remember from when we talked about the ancient Puebloans, they built these homes into the side of the cliffs to help keep the houses cool and to help give them protection. Now you can see over here, there's a few vocabulary words that we're going to talk about. We have adapt, staple, surplus, adobe, Hogan, and trade network. So these are different vocab words that we're going to be talking about today. So let's start with the Southwest. The desert Southwest, with its mesas, canyons, cliffs, and mountains, was a hard place to live. Intense summer heat is usually followed by bitter winter cold. Weeks can go by without a drop of rain or snow. So we have our first line on our note sheet, the land. What type of area was it? Was it a forest? Was it an Arctic area? Or was it a desert? It was a desert, so it was hot and dry, but also got cold in winter. So our desert was hot and dry in the summer, hot and dry in summer, and cold in the winter. And if this ever happens to you where your lines are not quite going where you want, you can highlight it all, and then usually this pops up, and you can decrease the size to make it fit. Or you could also, once you highlight it, you could go over here to home, and then you can choose the size over here too. So they lived in a desert, and the summer was hot and dry, and in the winter it got cold. So it's a hard place to live, a harsh environment. So they had to figure out different ways to adapt to the living in that area. So now we're looking at the subheading here, adapting to the Southwest. And again, if you look at our note sheet, you can see that that's where we're at here as well. Among the Native Americans who were able to adapt or adjust their ways of life to this land were the Hopi and the Zuni. So if you see the word adapt, remember we've got our definition right after. Adjust their ways of life to this land. So when you're adapting, you're changing either something about yourself or changing how you live to be able to survive in the place where you're at. So they were adapting, they were changing different ways. Now, I know you guys are talking in science or just got done talking about adaptations. It's the same thing. So in science, you're talking about how different plants and animals adapt to the environment. Now we're talking about people and how they change their way of life or do things a certain way to be able to survive in the land that they're at. So the Hopi lived in what is today the state of Arizona. The Zuni lived further east in present-day New Mexico. They and most other groups in this region became known as the Pueblo peoples. Like their ancient Puebloan ancestors, they lived in pueblos built on mesas or on the sides of steep canyons. So that's one way they adapted. You know, they made their houses to help keep them safe and cool in their environment. So they figured out that if they built the mesas into the cliffs, it would keep them cool and give them protection. So that was one of their adaptations. Even in the dry environment, the Pueblo people were able to grow their staple or main foods of corn, beans, and squash. So they found different ways to collect water. So they used an irrigation system. They got water to and from, the water sources and took it to their foods so they could grow it. But they also figured out ways to collect water, either through dew or the little bit of rain that they would get. And they would store it to be able to use it to grow their food. So their main food, or their staple foods, that's what staple means, like a staple food. When we were talking about the Plains Indians, their staple food was the buffalo. That was their main source of food. So their main source of food was the corn, beans, and squash. So if we come to our note sheet, their staple foods were corn, beans, and squash. Corn, beans, and squash. Now we're coming back here. They found ways to collect water and to store surplus or extra amounts of food. So if they had that extra food, they would store it so they could use it for other things, or they would be able to use it down the road when the growing season was over. So as they grew more than what they needed at that time, that was called their surplus, and they were able to store it to use for labor later. The Pueblo also grew cotton, which they used to weave blankets and clothing. So that was our next one. They also grew cotton and used it to weave clothing and blankets. So filling those in, clothing and blankets. Now we're going to talk about their culture. Not all the people who lived in the Southwest were Pueblo. The Navajo moved into the Southwest about 1025 AD, settling in the Four Corners area. The Navajo had led mainly nomadic lives before, but they learned to adapt to the harsh climate. During a period of drought, some Hopi people went to live with the Navajo. In time, the Navajo began growing food and cotton as the Hopi did. So when the Hopi went to live with the Navajo, they taught the Navajo some different ways of how to adapt to the environment. Now we're going to come here to the culture. The desert environment shaped both how the Pueblo and the Navajo lived. Little rain fell, so few trees grew. The Hopi and the Zuni used stones and mud to build pueblos. Other groups made houses from adobe, which is sun-dried bricks made of clay and straw. So they'd mix clay and straw together and create those bricks and then let them dry in the sun. The Navajo built homes called hogans. These cone-shaped shelters were built by covering a wooden frame with mud or adobe. So it's kind of this shape, but instead of this grass on top, they would cover it in the mud that looks, similar to these. So they'd build the cone shape and then cover it with the adobe. Navajo hogans were often miles apart, unlike homes in Pueblo villages. Pueblo and Navajo tribes depended on trade for resources not found nearby. So if they didn't have the items that they needed, they would trade with others. They sometimes traveled far to trade their pottery and baskets with other tribes. So we're going to hop back to our note sheet. So what shaped their lives? What made them have to adapt? What, determined how they lived or what they made? It was their desert environment. So living in the desert, determined how they were building their houses. So just like the Woodlands Indians, they made their houses out of wood because that's what was available to them. But the Navajo and the Hopi made their homes out of clay and straw because that's what was available to them. But if they needed items that weren't around them, how would they get them? What did they depend on for resources that they couldn't find nearby? Trading. They had to trade with other groups. Now we're going to talk about the religion and government of these people. So we look for the subheading here, religion and government of the Pueblo culture. Both the Pueblo and the Navajo people honored their gods in special ceremonies. Navajo ceremonies, for example, were led by religious leaders and healers called medicine people. Medicine people memorized and sang songs or chants that they believed had healing powers. Religion had a strong role in the government of the Pueblo. Usually, a chief, who was also a religious leader, led the Hopi village. The chief made rules and carried out the punishments. The Navajo were organized in groups with its own religious leader. The leaders met every few years to make decisions. So if we come back here, the person who led the Navajo ceremonies was that religious leader, or they called them medicine people. So medicine people, or medicine people were the one who memorized the saying and sang songs or chants that they believed to have healing powers. So they were led by religious leaders or healers called medicine people. And then when we come here, what had a strong role in the government of the Pueblo? It was religion. A lot of their decisions and who's the rulers was based on their beliefs. So that was the Pueblos. They lived in the desert area. And so living in the desert determined what they did, what they grew, and how they built their houses. Now we're going to talk about the groups to the west. So these are the people who are closer to the coast. So they're closer to the Pacific Ocean. They live there in California on the coast. We're going to listen for 3 different groups of people as we read. So now we're coming up here, groups to the west. Many different groups of Native Americans lived among the mountains, deserts, valleys, forests, and coastal lands that stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. Among the groups living in the western part of what is now the United States were those of the Plateau, Great Basin, and California cultures. Ways of life. The Shoshone lived part of the year in the Great Basin. They hunted small animals and they built shelters with dry brush. They spent the rest of the year hunting buffalo in the mountains of present-day Wyoming. So the Shoshone was that first group. So here we're going to put the Shoshone. And if you look back at our reading, they first lived part of the year in the Great Basin. There they hunted those small animals and then they built shelters with dry brush. If you remember back to when you had to put the pictures of the different shelters, this group had the pole and brush houses. which is just taking long sticks or poles and then covering it with brush, which would be, you know, think about when you're cleaning up your yard, you have all that pile of like sticks and leaves, that is the brush. So they would build their houses made out of dry brush. But then another part of the year, they would go into the mountains in Wyoming to hunt buffalo. So over here, their way of life, part of the year, hunted small animals, comma, other part hunted buffalo in the mountains. And again, if this is too big, you always come here and make it smaller. We'll see what 12 is like. And then if you need to move it up a little, you can do that as well, or extend it out a little to make it fit a little better. That is okay too. So now we're going to listen for the second group of people that lived in the West. The Nez Perce lived to the northwest on the Columbia Plateau. Its dry hills and flat lands include parts of what is now Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. For food, the Nez Perce relied on the many rivers and streams that drain the high plateau. So if they're using the rivers and streams, what animal do you think they ate a lot of? That was fish. So the Nez Perce made long spears and nets to catch salmon. Salmon was such an important part of their diet that the Nez Perce built movable shelters to use while fishing. So our second group was the Nez Perce. And to them, salmon equals very important. So salmon was very important. They depended heavily on the salmon for food, so heavily that they would even move their houses around to go where the salmon were. Now we're going to look at our third group that lived in the West. So now we're looking at here. The Chumash lived in what is now Southern California. The area they lived in was rich with birds, fish, and acorns. Their villages were located near the Pacific Ocean, which was also an important source of food. They built dome-shaped shelters that they covered with thick layers of tule, a tall, flexible marsh plant with a spongy stem. The Chumash were also expert traders and canoe builders. So if you can look down here, you can see a Chumash village. So here's their homes. They built them cones and then put the tule over top of them. And the tule is those reeds or like the tall grasses that they put over top of it for the covering. They were the expert canoe builders that they used to go fishing, to go back and forth, to trade with other tribes. So our next group was the Chumash. And for them, we're going to put that their food was birds, fish, and acorns, that their shelters were made of tule, and they were expert traders. So food equals birds, fish, and acorns. And then we're going to go down and we'll put that shelters were made of tule, and they were expert traders. And we'll need to make this smaller so we can fit it on there. I'm going to try 10. See if I can get it to fit on there that way. I can move it up just a little bit, and even if it goes down below, that's okay. So now we're going to talk about trading. So since we're talking about the Chumash being expert traders, now we're going to see why and how they traded. So we're going to go to the next page now, trading for needed goods. Native Americans in the Plateau, Great Basin, and California cultural regions depended on nearby natural resources. To get goods they could not make or find themselves, they formed large trade networks. These networks allowed them to get goods from faraway places. So they would trade with each other, and then those goods would get traded throughout all the different regions. If a tribe was not able to get to the faraway area, they might be able to trade with a tribe next to them, who then would trade with the tribe next to them. And so the goods are just constantly being traded and rotated so everyone can get what they need, even if they're not able to use that natural resource themselves from the area or not able to make something. Native Americans did not always travel to those faraway places. They traded with people in nearby villages. In turn, the people of those villages traded with villages farther away. In this way, goods and ideas could travel long distances. The people of the Southwest and the West adapted to a variety of environments. They also traded for needed goods by forming trade networks. Now we're going to come back to our note sheet. So people formed what to be able to get the goods that they needed? They formed trade networks. They formed trade networks. Trade networks. Trade networks. Make that a little bit smaller so it fits on there. So why did they make trade networks? To get goods they could not get or make themselves. That way they had, more access to more items. Whoops. To get goods they could not get or make themselves. Thinking about the Pueblo or the Hopi or the Navajo, they didn't have as much access to wood as the other, tribes. But if they traded with, those who were close by that maybe had access to wood, then they could get wood. And, the other tribes probably weren't able to make as strong of pottery because they did not have as much access to the clay as the Navajo or the Hopi. So they would trade with each other to get what they needed. So go through and make sure you have all of your boxes filled in on your note sheet. Once you do, then you'll click close. And then come over here to worksheet 18, and this will be your homework. So on worksheet 18, you're going to be using vocab words to fill in boxes. So again, click Edit Presentation, Edit in Browser. And then once it pulls up, I'll zoom in so we can see it. So we'll click View, Zoom, 100%. So this is the word bank up here. You're going to be using the words adapt, buffalo, trade networks, and staple and surplus. So remember, adapt means, changing your way of life to the land, to the way the land is. Buffalo is the animal that, the Shoshone would go hunt in the mountains. They spent part of their year hunting there. And then they would hunt the small animals in the other part of the year. A trade network is, when they formed that group to get the goods they could not make or find themselves. Staple means their main food. So remember, like the Plains Indians, their staple food was a buffalo. And then surplus. So, if you had extra of these food, you could store it. So you're going to fill in those boxes with those words. When you finish that, you'll click close and then click turn it in. If you'd like, you can write these answers on another piece of paper and send me that picture. You can print these papers off, fill it in, send that to me. If you have any questions, send me an email or a message here on Teams.